than 4 years have passed since the San Bernardino attack, the FBI dropped its legal effort to force Apple to help it create a method of accessing data on a locked iPhone 5C used by Syed Rizwan Farook, one of the killers. There's a reason that we're beginning with that terrible memory at this Sci-Fi 2020 fireside. Consider how Tim Cook explains Apple's decision to appeal a court order which required the company to help the FBI. Cook said, and I quote, "Somebody should pass a law that makes it clear what the boundaries are. This thing shouldn't be done court by court by court by court." Play that soundbite today, and the construct is still very much in play. We're talking encryption. We're talking about its still fuzzy boundaries. Marshall Erwin joins us from the US West Coast. Marshall is a chief security officer at Mozilla, and he brings years of hands-on counterterrorism and cybersecurity experience to the Sci-Fi platform. And this is the question I'm going to begin with. The reason that the San Bernardino case was so contentious was that at first glance, the two parties appeared to be defending principles that were both compelling and irreconcilable. How should we think about encryption where we can embrace the technology we love and yet get the safety we need? Over to you, Marshall.
Mozilla has been heavily invested in efforts to roll out stronger default encryption, both in devices and in sort of end-to-end encrypted messaging systems for a long time. Really, we are on what feels like in the third decade of this debate. But the Apple versus FBI story, I think, really crystallized a lot of the sort of positions here that we're still really grappling with. So we believe that encryption is just fundamentally critical for building a more secure internet. And the internet today, just so that we're all very crystal clear on this, it is simply not as secure as it needs to be for consumers and really for everybody. And so we think that fundamentally, like, encryption is the most critical tool that we can put in place to address that underlying problem that we are all struggling with in many different facets of our lives. Some of the important ways that I think I think about this issue, especially in the context of the Apple versus FBI story, is to think about it in terms of risk. As in, there's, whether we think about sort of default encryption on a device or end-to-end encryption, all of the different proposals introduce some level of risk and there's some level of cost, and there might be some benefits as well. And I think the smart way to approach this issue is to really try to understand and drill down into what those costs are, what the benefits are, and what the underlying risk is. And that's what we really tried to do at Mozilla when thinking about the Apple FBI story. I would contrast that with what is, I think, sometimes a rather sort of rote legalistic way to think about this that was also on display in the after the San Bernardino attack, which is a way to just think about what is the law, what does the law allow, can a judge grant it, and if a judge can grant it, then I should have it. That tends to be the rather rote legal way to think about this, which isn't premised on the underlying question about the risk. And so if you think about what that means in reality and what it meant in the FBI Apple story, it meant that a judge may or may not have determined that the FBI had the legal authority to make that request. But regardless, if Apple were to have gone along with that request, what it would have done is introduced a vulnerability that would have been sort of existential and put a much larger set of users at risk. So that's what we think about when we want to analyze this in terms of the underlying risk. It's not a question about whether there's legal authority or what the right judicial process should be or what the legal standard should be. It's a question of whether by granting law enforcement access, you introduce an extensive set of sort of existential systematic risks that are actually more problematic. So that's, I think, the most critical thing to understand here. Is like, it's a question of risk, not really a question of law. The other thing that I think is really interesting in retrospect about that story is fundamentally the technical questions, the question about the risk of the access, very similar to the debate that we're still having today. But one thing that has changed significantly since only a few years ago is so much of the debate now has shifted to focusing on issues associated with content. I think we have all become much more aware of the sort of malicious or harmful impacts that content can have online, sometimes on these major platforms. And as a result, uh, much more of the focus now in the discussion is about how we should change liability laws with respect to encryption. Whereas in the Apple FBI story, it was a question of how we should change surveillance law. Both of those ideas, in my view, are wrong, but it does show you that there's been a real major shift in how people are thinking about this issue, even though the underlying technical challenges are essentially the same.
So India, along with the Five Eyes network, wants companies to build backdoors to end-to-end encrypted content. So when we put that question to Mishi Chaudhry, who's a technology lawyer, her reaction was that if you build backdoors for James Bond, others are going to use it too. Your reaction?
As you mentioned at the outset, I've spent a large part of the beginning of my career in working on counterterrorism. And I try to be very mindful of what it's like for national security and law enforcement professionals on a day to day basis who are really exposed to some horrible stuff. And I think it triggers a really strong protective instinct. They're the people responsible for protecting people and avoiding some of the worst outcomes. And I think it can be very frustrating when they are seeking to really address some of that really horrible stuff, and encryption gets in their way. And so I think sometimes our community, the tech community, can be a little bit too dismissive of the challenges that law enforcement or national security professionals can run into here. At the same time, in sitting where I am now as the sort of chief security officer at Mozilla, I see that our users are constantly under attack. And as a company, we're constantly under attack. And that problem feels much more systemic and much more strategically relevant, both for national security as well as society writ large. And for that purpose, endorsing strong encryption without backdoors is critical. And I find it very frustrating when some real national security leaders, like in this letter, take positions like this, because I think ultimately it represents essentially a delinquency of vision and failure of strategic thinking. These are national security leaders who are most responsible for defining the strategies that are going to keep us all safe. And yet, by taking a path that focuses on these narrow investigative needs, they potentially undermine our broader security interests, which I really think is a shame. To your direct question, kind of how do you provide exceptional access or a backdoor to James Bond and prevent everyone else from accessing that? The short answer is you can't, and that's the fundamental challenge here. There's I think two ways in which that's challenging. First is, as soon as the mechanism exists to get the access, other regimes will attempt to use that same mechanism, either through legitimate lawful process or otherwise. The other challenge is that these access regimes are just very difficult to build and can result in a lot of mistakes. One sort of fundamental premise of security work is complexity is the enemy of security. And so when you design an access mechanism, you're adding complexity, you're adding to the likelihood that you're going to make mistakes that then attackers can exploit to gain access to the data. And that's why ultimately you can't give access to James Bond unless you're going to give access to the others attackers who are going to use that access maliciously.
What's the clarity that we have right now on that thin line between when data is resting and when it's still in use?
I think the important thing to understand about this data at rest and data in motion distinction is it goes back to this first point that I made, that some things are riskier than others. Generally, I think an exceptional access regime or backdoors, it's very risky to create these mechanisms. However, one secret that people don't like to talk about is that it's actually much riskier when we think about creating exceptional access mechanisms for communications, or what is sometimes called data in transit. Because people are communicating in real time, their devices can be accessed remotely by virtue of them communicating across the internet. And so designing an access regime that addresses that is a very fraught task. And there's much higher level of risk associated with that. Whereas data at rest is a question of like, is the data on your phone encrypted when it's sitting in your pocket? Um, it is also a very risky endeavor to design an access regime around that, but it's at least a little simpler than designing an access regime for data in transit. And so, one, again, to go back to the letter that you mentioned earlier, one of the things that I think is still remarkable about this debate is that national security and law enforcement professionals don't make this distinction. They don't really like the idea that some of this stuff is riskier than others and that we should focus on the less risky pieces. They just want blanket access, which is really not the responsible way to think about solving this problem.
There's this inherent tension between encryption in its narrow sense and the privacy that encryption was designed to protect. Relevant, especially in the WhatsApp traceability case. Your view?
So again, like I think what's a real change over the last few years is this general, like much greater awareness about the way in which malicious content can spread across these platforms. And that's sort of the crux of the issue that we see in a lot of places. For example, it's one of the issues that's at play with WhatsApp and traceability is a desire to understand the origin of information that might be deceptive or might ultimately be causing harm. Um, and I certainly am much more aware of the broad harmful implications of a lot of this information that's spreading across these platforms. And that's a problem that we at Mozilla take very, very seriously. Um, but what I think is really critical to solving those problems are focusing on what I describe as the amplification problems. As in, when we think about recommendation systems or WhatsApp groups, often these are designed in ways that make information go viral. And once that information is viral, it can cause harm really quickly. And so the right way to solve some of these content challenges is to actually decrease the virality of the platforms, which is actually very different than thinking like, okay, these platforms are going to be really, really viral, but I need a mechanism to trace it back, right? That's almost too late. That's when once you're tracing back that information on WhatsApp, the harm has already occurred. It's kind of a band-aid. Whereas decreasing the virality, addressing the amplification that happens on these major platforms, again, whether it's WhatsApp or YouTube or Facebook groups, we see a lot of the same things, which is these recommendation systems or the low friction systems really pushing out information to really broad audiences. We need to address that underlying problem.
Yes. So one of the others who's spoken at this Times Square series, Dipan Ghosh from the Harvard Kennedy School. So he spoke to exactly this piece about how when you expose or when you make it transparent, how that virality is caused. And that's when the business model unravels. That's when the margins get hit. And that's far better and far more effective than um, just mere content moderation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've identified the real problem is there's a strong business incentive to amp up this virality as much as possible, and there needs to be some counter mechanism that encourages these platforms to do something different. Otherwise, the basic business incentive they have is to engineer the systems in this exact way. I would point to like some of the recent changes we've seen with, for example, WhatsApp, where they've changed the way in which content can be recommended to large amounts of groups. So that's a really, in my view, like healthy change that can limit the virality of information. And it's the type of change that we need to see on these platforms. It's very similar at a high level to what we saw Twitter announce just last week in the context of the US elections, where it's making it more difficult to recommend content that is going viral. And I think we need to see more of that. It's not in any way sufficient, but those are positive steps, and we're only really starting to see those positive steps right now, which is a shame because these platforms have been designed this way, and we see this content just spreading and causing harm. And it would have been great if we had companies that had been a little bit more proactive here and content liability or moderation regimes that had better incentivized them to do this before the harm is actually occurring, which is what we see now.
Marshall, there will certainly be instances when legal authorities want access to encrypted information that they can't get at. Terrorism investigations aren't the only example, right? So, absent methods of accessing those systems protected by encryption, where does that leave them? And what would you do differently? What would you do if you're on the other side?
I think this gets to this debate that you sometimes hear between the sort of the going dark framework, where law enforcement will say it's going dark and it's losing the information it needs, and the sort of counter idea is the golden age of surveillance, which is the idea that there's so much information out there. They're not dark at all. They're sort of living in the sunlight of day. And actually, I think the real answer there is somewhere in between. The truth is there is a ton of information about out there about everybody. So as sort of the lead for a lot of our privacy and security work for our users, I know how much information is out there about everybody. It scares me. And that is information that is available to law enforcement or national security professionals if they go through appropriate process. And what I believe those communities need to do is they need to invest to be much more nimble and have smart ways to go about getting that information that exists and is still going to exist in the future. It might not be easy, and no one said it gets to be easy, but there is ultimately a ton of information about their potential available to their investigative interest if they have the proper efforts and resources to go after it, even if they don't have exceptional access or backdoor access to some of this encrypted data. They just need to have the resources and time and dedication to go after that data that already exists. I use that term. I sometimes will use the term the going slowly problem. The basic idea of the going slowly problem is there is a ton of data about everybody available. It is not as easy to get that data as it would be if there was some easy backdoor mechanism available to law enforcement. So it takes a little bit longer. So law enforcement isn't really going dark. It still has plenty of information, but it does take a little bit longer, and it takes more effort to get that. And then as a result, law enforcement needs to be a little bit more targeted than it would have been only a few years ago.